In a world where silence is often mistaken for safety, one woman's courage to speak truth would cost her everything she held dear. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that exposing corruption in her small Montana town would turn her neighbors into enemies, her workplace into a battlefield, and her own family against her. But when the threats escalated beyond words and her life hung by a thread, salvation came from the most unexpected source. A mysterious cowboy, whose past was as dark as the secrets Sarah had dared to reveal. This is not just a story about standing up for what's right. It's about the price of truth, the weight of silence, and the extraordinary lengths one person will go to protect another when everyone else has turned away. What Sarah discovered that autumn evening would shake the foundations of everything she believed about justice, loyalty, and the thin line between heroism and survival. Some stories begin with a choice. This one began with a conscience that refused to stay quiet, even when staying quiet meant staying alive. Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who noticed details others missed. It was what made her an excellent accountant and what would ultimately turn her life upside down. At 34, she had built a quiet, comfortable existence in Millbrook, Montana, a town of barely 3,000 people where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. The offices of Millbrook County Development sat on Main Street between Harper's General Store and the old barber shop that had been closed for 5 years. Sarah had worked there for 8 years, managing the books for various municipal projects, from road maintenance to the new community center that had been the talk of the town for months. She knew every expense, every contractor payment, every budget allocation, down to the penny. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Sarah first noticed the discrepancy. She was reviewing the quarterly reports for the community center project when she spotted an invoice that made her stomach drop. Mountain Peak Construction had been paid $47,000 for foundation work that, according to the project timeline, shouldn't have begun for another month. Sarah pulled up the construction schedule on her computer and cross-referenced it with the bank statements. The payment had been processed 3 weeks ago. Sarah's first instinct was to assume it was a simple error. Maybe someone had misfiled the invoice, or perhaps Mountain Peak had done some preliminary work she wasn't aware of. She walked across the hall to her supervisor's office, clutching the paperwork in her hand. Tom Bradley had been the development office director for 15 years. He was a heavy-set man with graying hair and a reputation for being fair but firm. When Sarah knocked on his door that morning, he was on the phone, but he gestured for her to sit down while he finished his call. "What can I do for you, Sarah?" Tom asked as he hung up the receiver. "I found something odd in the community center accounts," Sarah said, laying the invoice on his desk. "This payment to Mountain Peak Construction seems to be ahead of schedule. According to our timeline, they shouldn't have started foundation work yet." Tom glanced at the paperwork, then at Sarah. For just a moment, something flickered across his face that she couldn't quite read. "Let me look into this," he said, taking the papers from her. "Sometimes contractors get started early if the weather's good, and their schedule permits. I'll check with the site manager." Sarah nodded, satisfied with the explanation. She returned to her desk and continued with her work. But something nagged at her throughout the day. It wasn't just the early payment that bothered her, it was Tom's reaction. In all her years working for him, she had never seen him handle a potential discrepancy so casually. 2 days later, Sarah was organizing receipts when she found another irregularity. This time, it was a payment to Valley Equipment Rental for machinery that, according to the project specifications, wasn't needed until the following month. The payment was for $23,000, and like the Mountain Peak invoice, it had been processed weeks ahead of schedule. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she pulled up more records on her computer. She began systematically going through every payment made in the last 6 months for the community center project. What she found made her hands shake. Over the past half year, there had been at least a dozen payments that didn't align with the project timeline. The amounts weren't enormous by themselves, but together they totaled more than $200,000. She printed out all the relevant documents and spread them across her desk, creating a timeline of payments versus project milestones. The pattern was clear. Money was being paid out for work that either hadn't been completed yet or, in some cases, might not need to be completed at all. Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe the project was ahead of schedule, though she hadn't heard anything about that. Maybe there were legitimate reasons for the early payments that she wasn't aware of. But a cold feeling in her stomach told her that something was very wrong. She decided to drive by the community center site during her lunch break. The construction area was on the north side of town, where the old grain elevator used to stand. As Sarah pulled up to the chain-link fence surrounding the site, She could see immediately that the foundation work Mountain Peak had supposedly been paid for was nowhere near completion. In fact, it looked like they had barely begun excavating. Sarah sat in her car, staring at the partially cleared lot. The invoice she had found showed payment for completed foundation work, but what she was looking at was maybe a week's worth of preliminary excavation. Either Mountain Peak was the slowest construction company in Montana, or they had been paid for work they hadn't done. That afternoon, Sarah couldn't concentrate on anything. She kept thinking about the discrepancies, about Tom's reaction, about the gap between what had been paid for and what had actually been accomplished at the construction site. By the time 5 o'clock came around, she had made a decision. She was going to dig deeper. After everyone else had left the office, Sarah stayed behind. She used her access to the computer system to pull up records going back 2 years. If there were irregularities in the community center project, she wondered if there might be similar problems with other municipal projects. What she found over the next 3 hours of searching was worse than she had imagined. The pattern of early or inflated payments extended to virtually every major project the development office had overseen in the past 18 months. Road repair contracts, the new fire station equipment, even the renovation of the town library, all showed the same troubling discrepancies between payments made and work completed. Sarah's hands were trembling as she printed out page after page of evidence. She was looking at what appeared to be systematic fraud involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in public funds. The money that was supposed to be improving their community was being siphoned off through inflated contracts and payments for work that was either incomplete or unnecessary. As she gathered the documents into a folder, Sarah heard the sound of a key turning in the main office door. Her heart stopped. Everyone was supposed to have gone home hours ago. She quickly turned off her computer monitor and shoved the papers into her purse, but she wasn't fast enough. Sarah? Tom Bradley's voice echoed through the office. What are you doing here so late? Just catching up on some filing, Sarah called back, hoping her voice sounded normal. I was just about to leave. Tom appeared in her cubicle doorway. His usually friendly expression was replaced by something harder, more calculating. Find everything you were looking for? The question sent a chill down Sarah's spine. There was something in the way he asked it that suggested he knew exactly what she had been doing. Just the usual end-of-month reconciliation, she said, gathering her things. Nothing special. Tom nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on her. You know, Sarah, sometimes when we're trying to be thorough, we can misinterpret things. Accounting can be complicated, especially when you're not seeing the full picture. Of course, Sarah agreed quickly. I always double-check anything that seems unusual. That's good, Tom said. That's very good. But remember, if you have concerns about anything, you should bring them to me first. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings that could cause problems for people who are just trying to do their jobs. Sarah nodded and headed for the door, acutely aware that Tom was watching her every move. As she walked to her car, she could feel his eyes on her through the office window. Only when she had driven several blocks away did she allow herself to breathe normally again. At home that evening, Sarah spread the documents across her kitchen table and tried to make sense of what she had discovered. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone was stealing from the town of Millbrook, using fake or inflated invoices to redirect public funds. Based on what she had found, the scheme had been going on for at least 18 months and involved multiple contractors and projects. The question that kept her awake most of the night was what to do about it. Tom Bradley was clearly involved, probably orchestrating the whole thing. But how far did it go? Were other people in the development office part of it? What about the contractors who were receiving the fraudulent payments? Sarah had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. Her father had taught her that integrity wasn't just about being honest when it was easy. It was about standing up for what was right, even when there was a cost. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she began to understand just how high that cost might be. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work to find Tom waiting at her desk. He was holding a coffee cup and wearing what she now recognized as a forced smile. "Morning, Sarah," he said. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. You mentioned you were working on reconciliation, and I realized I should probably explain some of the timing issues you might have noticed in the community center accounts." Sarah's mouth felt dry, but she managed to nod. That would be helpful. You see, sometimes we have to make payments in advance to secure better rates from contractors, especially in a competitive market like construction. It's all above board. But it might look unusual if you're just looking at the payment dates without understanding the context. I see, Sarah said, though she didn't see at all. What Tom was describing might explain one or two early payments, but not the systematic pattern she had discovered. "I'm glad we cleared that up," Tom continued. "I'd hate for there to be any confusion that might lead to unnecessary reports or investigations. Those things can be very disruptive, and they rarely lead to anything productive." The message was clear. Keep quiet, or there would be consequences. Sarah spent the rest of the day pretending to work while her mind churned through her options. She could ignore what she had found and hope someone else would eventually discover it. She could confront Tom directly and demand answers. Or she could take her evidence to someone outside the development office. By the end of the week, Sarah had made her choice. She couldn't ignore what she had found, and confronting Tom would be pointless since he was clearly part of the scheme. That left taking her evidence to the authorities. On Monday morning, Sarah called in sick to work and drove to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Mike Morrison had been elected 2 years ago on a platform of transparency and accountability. If anyone would take her concerns seriously, it would be him. Sheriff Morrison listened patiently as Sarah explained what she had discovered. She showed him the documents she had copied, walking him through the timeline of payments and the discrepancies with actual project progress. When she finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. "This is serious stuff, Sarah," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at significant fraud involving public funds. But I have to warn you, accusations like this can have major consequences, both for the people you're accusing and for you." "I understand," Sarah replied. "But I can't just pretend I didn't see this. That money belongs to the people of this town." Sheriff Morrison nodded approvingly. "I respect that. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start a quiet investigation into these payments. I'll need you to document everything you found and provide copies of all relevant records." "But Sarah, you need to understand that once this gets out, your life in Millbrook is going to change. This town doesn't like troublemakers, even when they're right." Sarah left the sheriff's office feeling both relieved and terrified. She had done the right thing, but she was beginning to understand that doing the right thing sometimes came with a price she hadn't calculated. The investigation that followed would consume the next 3 months of Sarah's life and change everything she thought she knew about her quiet little town. What she didn't know was that her decision to speak up would not only cost her the life she had built in Millbrook, but would eventually put her in mortal danger from people who had far more to lose than she had imagined. The investigation began quietly, just as Sheriff Morrison had promised, but in a town the size of Millbrook, secrets had a way of surfacing like weeds after rain. Sarah continued working at the development office, maintaining the pretense of normalcy while secretly cooperating with the sheriff's investigation. Every document she provided, every detail she verified, brought them closer to understanding the full scope of the fraud. What they discovered was worse than Sarah had initially suspected. The scheme wasn't limited to construction projects. It extended into supply contracts, service agreements, and even some of the town's utility arrangements. Over the course of 2.5 years, more than $500,000 in public funds had been diverted through a network of inflated contracts and phantom services. Tom Bradley was at the center of it all, but he wasn't working alone. The investigation revealed connections to several prominent local business owners, including Jake Morrison, who owned Morrison Construction and happened to be the sheriff's younger brother. That revelation hit Sheriff Morrison like a physical blow, and Sarah watched him age years in the span of a single afternoon. "I never suspected," Sheriff Morrison told Sarah during one of their clandestine meetings in his office. "Jake's business has been struggling for years, but I thought he was turning it around through hard work and better management. I never imagined he was stealing from the town that elected me to protect it." The personal nature of the betrayal made the investigation even more complex. Sheriff Morrison had to recuse himself from certain aspects of the case and bring in investigators from the state attorney general's office. Sarah found herself interviewed by stern-faced officials who treated her more like a suspect than a whistleblower. It was during her third interview with the state investigators that the first crack appeared in Sarah's carefully maintained facade at work. She had requested another afternoon off, claiming a dentist appointment, but when she returned to the office, Tom Bradley was waiting for her with questions. "You've been having a lot of medical appointments lately," he observed, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "I hope everything's okay." "Just routine stuff," Sarah replied, but she could feel her face flushing. She had never been a good liar. "That's good to hear," Tom said. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation a few weeks ago. About those payment discrepancies you noticed, I realized I might not have explained things as clearly as I should have." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Everything seemed clear to me. Well, that's the thing, Tom continued, moving closer to her desk. I've been reviewing those accounts and I'm concerned that someone might misinterpret what they're seeing. Someone who doesn't understand the full context might think there's something improper going on. The threat was becoming less subtle with each conversation. Sarah nodded and mumbled something about understanding, but she could see that Tom wasn't convinced. His suspicion was growing, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he figured out what was really happening. That time came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, Sarah arrived at work to find Tom cleaning out her desk drawers. He looked up when she approached, his expression cold and businesslike. "Sarah, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go," he said without preamble. "Budget cuts. The county is tightening its belt, and we can't justify maintaining our current staffing levels." Sarah stared at him, knowing it was a lie, but unable to challenge it directly. "This is very sudden," she managed. "These decisions often are," Tom replied, handing her a box containing her personal belongings. "I'm sure you understand. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you." As Sarah walked out of the development office for the last time, carrying her pathetic box of personal items, she felt the eyes of her former co-workers on her. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared relieved that they hadn't been the ones chosen for elimination. None of them said goodbye. The firing was just the beginning. Within a week, word had somehow spread throughout Millbrook that Sarah Mitchell was causing trouble for local businesses and government officials. The details were vague, but the message was clear. Sarah was not to be trusted, and anyone who associated with her was taking a risk. The isolation began gradually. The barista at her favorite coffee shop, who had always greeted her warmly, suddenly seemed too busy to chat. The clerk at the grocery store avoided eye contact when checking out her purchases. People she had known for years crossed the street rather than walk past her on the sidewalk. Sarah tried to maintain her normal routines, but everywhere she went, she felt the weight of suspicious stares and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Millbrook had always been a tight-knit community, but now that closeness felt suffocating rather than comforting. The first direct confrontation came on a Saturday morning at the farmer's market. Sarah was examining tomatoes at old Mrs. Daddy. Henderson stand when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Some people have a lot of nerve showing their faces in public after what they've done. Sarah turned to see Janet Morrison, Jake Morrison's wife, standing with 2 other women from the church. Janet's face was flushed with anger, and her voice was loud enough to draw attention from other shoppers. "Excuse me?" Sarah said, though she knew exactly what Janet was referring to. "Don't play innocent," Janet snapped. "Everyone knows you're the one spreading lies about honest business people, trying to destroy families because you can't stand to see others succeed." "I haven't spread any lies," Sarah replied quietly, conscious of the growing circle of onlookers. "My husband has worked his whole life to build his business," Janet continued, her voice rising. "He's provided jobs for this community, helped build the infrastructure that everyone benefits from, and now some jealous, bitter woman wants to tear him down with accusations and investigations." Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm.
"I'm sorry you feel that way, Janet, but I've only told the truth about what I found."
"The truth?" Janet laughed harshly. "The truth is that you're a troublemaker who lost her job because she was incompetent, and now you're trying to blame everyone else for your failures." The accusation stung because it contained just enough plausibility to be believable to people who wanted to believe it. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her and saw that some people were nodding in agreement with Janet's version of events. Mrs. Henderson, who had known Sarah since she was a child, quietly packed up the tomatoes Sarah had been examining and handed them to another customer. The message was clear. Sarah's business was no longer welcome. That confrontation was the first of many. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself the target of a whisper campaign that painted her as everything from a disgruntled employee seeking revenge to an unstable woman who couldn't be trusted. The narrative was carefully crafted to discredit her while avoiding any specific mention of the fraud investigation. The campaign was effective. Within a month of losing her job, Sarah found herself completely ostracized from the community she had called home for more than a decade. Her church asked her to consider attending services elsewhere until things settled down. The volunteer organizations she had been part of suddenly found reasons why her help was no longer needed. Even her neighbors began treating her like a pariah. The financial pressure was almost as devastating as the social isolation. Sarah had always been careful with money, but without a steady income, and with her reputation in tatters, finding new employment proved impossible. Every potential employer in the county had heard some version of the story about her causing trouble at the development office. Her applications were politely declined, often without even an interview. Sarah was forced to dip into her savings to pay rent and basic expenses. She applied for jobs outside the county, but even there, the network of connections and gossip seemed to precede her. Small-town Montana was still small-town Montana, and word traveled fast through the interconnected communities of the region. The isolation became complete when her own family began to distance themselves from her. Sarah's sister Linda, who lived 2 hours away in Billings, stopped returning her phone calls. Her brother, Mark, who worked for the state highway department, told her bluntly that her situation was causing problems for him at work and asked her to stop contacting him until this whole mess was resolved. "You should have minded your own business, Sarah," Mark told her during what would be their last conversation for months. "You had a good job, a stable life. Why did you have to go stirring up trouble?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Sarah replied. But even as she said it, she wondered if she had made the right choice. The evidence she had provided was solid, the investigation was proceeding, but the cost to her own life was becoming unbearable. The worst part was the loneliness. Sarah had always been somewhat introverted, comfortable with her own company, but the enforced isolation of being shunned by an entire community was something she had never experienced. Days would pass when she spoke to no one, except the clerk at the grocery store, who couldn't avoid taking her money. She tried to stay strong by reminding herself that the investigation was making progress. Sheriff Morrison, despite the personal cost of discovering his brother's involvement, had remained committed to seeing justice done. The state investigators had assured her that they had enough evidence to bring charges against several people, including Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison. But as the weeks turned into months, Sarah began to understand that even if the investigation succeeded, even if the guilty parties were prosecuted and convicted, her life in Millbrook was over. The damage to her reputation was too complete, the divisions too deep. Win or lose, she would have to start over somewhere else. The realization hit her one evening as she sat alone in her small apartment, eating a dinner of canned soup and crackers. She had done the right thing, she was sure of that. The money being stolen belonged to the people of Millbrook. Money that could have improved schools, fixed roads, provided better services for everyone. But the people of Millbrook didn't see it that way. To them, she was the problem, not the solution. Sarah had always believed that truth would prevail. The people would eventually recognize and appreciate someone who stood up for what was right. But she was learning that truth was often inconvenient, and people preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable realities. It was easier to blame the messenger than to confront the message. As winter settled over Millbrook, bringing with it the long, dark months that defined Montana's harsh season, Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Her savings were running dangerously low, her job prospects remained non-existent, and her isolation was becoming more complete with each passing day. What she didn't know was that her situation was about to become much worse. The people she had exposed weren't content to simply ostracize her and ruin her reputation. Some of them had decided that Sarah Mitchell knew too much and had caused too much trouble to be allowed to continue her interference. They had begun making plans that would escalate the situation far beyond social pressure and economic retaliation. The first hint of physical danger came on a cold December evening when Sarah found her car tires slashed in the parking lot behind her apartment building. There was no note, no message, just 4 ruined tires that would cost her money she couldn't afford to replace. When she called the police, the responding officer took a perfunctory report and suggested that it was probably just kids causing mischief. But Sarah knew better. The message was clear. "We know where you live, we know where you go, and we can reach you any time we want." The psychological warfare was escalating into something more tangible and more threatening. Sarah began to understand that speaking out had made her not just unpopular, but potentially unsafe. As she stood looking at her vandalized car in the dim light of the parking lot's single street lamp, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. She was completely alone in a community that had turned against her, with no allies, no protection, and apparently no limits on how far her enemies were willing to go to silence her. The question was no longer whether she had done the right thing by exposing the fraud. The question was whether she would survive the consequences of her courage long enough to see justice done. The slashed tires were just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life became a series of increasingly menacing incidents that made it clear someone wanted her gone from Millbrook, one way or another. Her mailbox was vandalized twice, painted with crude words that left no doubt about what some people thought of her. Her apartment building superintendent, Mr. Kowalski, who had always been friendly, suddenly found reasons to complain about her tenancy and began making noises about lease violations. Sarah tried to document each incident, calling the police every time something happened, but the responses were always the same. Officer Danny Wright, who seemed to be assigned to all her complaints, would take a brief report, suggest it was probably random vandalism or teenage pranks, and remind her that the police couldn't be everywhere at once. His tone grew more dismissive with each report, as if Sarah was becoming a nuisance rather than a victim. The breakthrough in the state investigation came in early January, just as Sarah was beginning to wonder if she would have to leave Millbrook before seeing any resolution to the case she had started. Sheriff Morrison called her with news that the state attorney general's office was ready to file charges against 6 individuals, including Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison. They'll be arrested next week, Sheriff Morrison told her during a tense phone conversation. Sarah, I need you to know that this is going to get worse before it gets better. Once the arrests are made public, people are going to know for certain that you were the source of the investigation. You need to be prepared for backlash. Sarah appreciated the warning, but she had already experienced months of backlash. How much worse could it get? She was about to find out. The arrests made the front page of the Millbrook Gazette and were covered by news stations in Billings and Great Falls. The headline read, "Local officials charged in fraud scheme." And the story detailed how more than $500,000 in public funds had been stolen through fake contracts and inflated invoices. Sarah's name wasn't mentioned in the coverage, but everyone in town knew who had blown the whistle. The reaction was swift and more intense than anything Sarah had experienced. Within hours of the story breaking, her phone began ringing with anonymous callers who hurled threats and accusations. Some promised they would make her pay for destroying innocent families. Others were more specific about what they intended to do to her. Sarah stopped answering her phone after the 5th call of the morning included detailed descriptions of sexual violence. But the calls didn't stop. They continued throughout the day and into the evening, forcing her to unplug her phone just to get some peace. The next morning, Sarah discovered that someone had thrown rocks through 2 windows of her apartment. The building superintendent, Mr. Kopp. Kowalski was unsympathetic when she reported the damage. "Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live," he suggested, not meeting her eyes. "This building used to be quiet before all this trouble started following you around." Sarah realized that her lease, which had another 4 months to run, was going to be terminated one way or another. The writing was on the wall, literally in some cases, as graffiti calling her a snitch and worse had appeared on the building's exterior walls overnight. But the most frightening incident occurred 3 days after the arrests. Sarah had driven to Great Falls to buy groceries, unable to shop in Millbrook without facing hostility and harassment. On the drive back, she noticed a pickup truck following her at a distance. When she slowed down, the truck slowed down. When she sped up, it matched her speed. Sarah's heart began pounding as she realized she was being deliberately followed. She considered driving to the police station, but that would mean leading whoever was behind her directly to the sheriff's office, potentially putting Sheriff Morrison in danger as well. Instead, she decided to drive to a well-lit gas station and see what happened. As soon as she pulled into the station, the pickup truck roared past without stopping. Sarah caught a glimpse of 2 men in the cab, but the evening light made it impossible to identify them. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, waiting to see if they would return, before finally deciding it was safe to continue home. But when Sarah reached her apartment building, she found the same pickup truck parked across the street. The 2 men were sitting inside, making no effort to hide their presence. They watched as she parked and walked to her building entrance, and they were still there when she looked out her window an hour later. Sarah called the police, but Officer Wright's response was predictably unhelpful. "Are they on public property?" he asked. "Yes, but they followed me home. They're obviously trying to intimidate me." "Ma'am, sitting in a parked vehicle on a public street isn't a crime. Unless they threaten you directly or come onto private property, there's nothing we can do." The truck stayed until nearly midnight, then disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. But Sarah knew the men would be back. The message was clear. "We know where you live. We can find you anytime, and the police won't help you." Sarah barely slept that night. Every sound in the building made her jump. Every car that passed on the street below made her peek through the blinds to see if it was the pickup truck returning. She began to understand that her situation had moved beyond mere harassment into something that felt genuinely dangerous. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. Sarah found herself checking and rechecking the locks on her door, avoiding windows, and jumping at shadows. She started varying her daily routines, never leaving at the same time or taking the same route twice in a row. The stress was exhausting, and she could feel her health beginning to suffer from the constant tension. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late January. Sarah had been at the public library, one of the few places in Millbrook where she could still go without facing overt hostility. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was one of the few people who still treated her with basic human decency, perhaps because she understood the value of truth and knowledge. Sarah stayed at the library until closing time, partly to avoid going home to her empty apartment, and partly because she felt safer in a public place. When Mrs. Bedelia Patterson locked up at 8 o'clock, Sarah walked to her car under the pale light of the parking lot's few functioning street lamps. She was fumbling with her keys when she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah turned to see three men approaching from different directions, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had planned this encounter. She recognized one of them as Jake Morrison, recently released on bail pending his trial. "Sarah Mitchell," Jake said, his voice carrying a tone of false friendliness. "We need to have a talk." Sarah's hand closed around her keys, positioning them between her fingers the way her father had taught her when she was in college. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Jake." "Oh, but we do," Jake replied, stepping closer. "See, you've caused a lot of problems for a lot of good people. Families are being torn apart because of your lies and accusations."
They're not lies, Sarah said, backing toward her car.
"The evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence can be misinterpreted," said one of the other men, whom Sarah recognized as Carl Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's son. "People can make mistakes when they think they understand something they don't." Sarah realized that all three men were now within a few feet of her, effectively blocking her escape routes. The parking lot was empty except for them, and the nearest businesses were already closed for the night. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake continued, his false friendliness dropping away. "You're going to call that state attorney and tell them you made a mistake. You're going to explain that you misunderstood what you were looking at and that you want to withdraw your cooperation with the investigation." "I won't do that," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Yes, you will," Jake said, taking another step closer. "Because if you don't, things are going to get very unpleasant for you. And I mean very unpleasant." The third man, whom Sarah didn't recognize, spoke for the first time. "We know where you live, where you shop, where you go. We know you're all alone in this town, with no friends, no family, no one who would even notice if something happened to you." The threat was explicit now, no longer hidden behind implications or suggestions. Sarah felt her heart racing, but she also felt something else. Anger. These men thought they could intimidate her into abandoning the truth because they had more muscle and fewer scruples. "I'm not changing my testimony," Sarah said firmly. "What you did was wrong, and the evidence proves it. Threatening me won't change that." Jake's expression darkened. "You stupid woman. Do you have any idea what you're dealing with? This isn't some game where good guys always win. This is real life, and real life has consequences." He reached out as if to grab her arm, but Sarah stepped back quickly. "Don't touch me. If you assault me, it'll just add another charge to your list." "Assault?" Jake laughed. "Who's going to believe you? You're the crazy lady who makes up stories about honest businessmen. If something happens to you, people will just figure you brought it on yourself." Sarah realized the conversation was about to escalate into physical violence. She was outnumbered 3-1, in an isolated location, with no one around to help. Her only chance was to get to her car and drive away before they could stop her. She made her move suddenly, diving toward her car door and managing to get the key into the lock before Jake could reach her. But as she yanked the door open, Carl Henderson grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. "You're not going anywhere until we're finished talking," he snarled. Sarah brought her knee up hard, aiming for Carl's groin, but he twisted away, and the blow caught him in the thigh instead. He cursed and shoved her backward, causing her to stumble and fall against the side of her car. "That was a mistake," Jake said, moving toward her with clear intent. But before he could reach her, the sound of an approaching vehicle made all four of them freeze. Headlights swept across the parking lot as a pickup truck turned in from the main road. For a moment, Sarah thought it might be more of their associates, but then she heard something that made her heart leap with hope. The distinctive sound of a horse trailer rattling behind the truck. The truck pulled up next to them and stopped. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, moving with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with confrontation. He was tall and lean, wearing a worn denim jacket and cowboy hat that had seen better days. Sarah had never seen him before, but there was something about his presence that immediately changed the dynamics of the situation. "Evening, folks," the stranger said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone from further south. "Is there some kind of problem here?" Jake straightened up, trying to regain his composure. "No problem, friend. Just having a conversation. Looked more like three men cornering one woman, the stranger observed, his tone remaining conversational but with an edge of steel underneath. That doesn't seem like much of a conversation to me. This is none of your business, Carl snapped. Keep driving. The stranger tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and mocking. Well, I was planning to do just that, but then I saw what looked like someone in distress. My mama raised me not to ignore that kind of situation. Sarah found her voice. They were threatening me, she said quickly. They want me to lie about something I witnessed. Is that so? The stranger asked, his hand moving casually to rest on his belt. Sarah noticed he was wearing a knife in a leather sheath. Ma'am, would you like a ride somewhere safe?
She's not going anywhere with you, Jake said, stepping forward aggressively.
Like I said, this is none of your business. Actually, it became my business the moment you decided to threaten a woman in a parking lot, the stranger replied. His voice remained calm, but there was something in his posture that made all three men hesitate. Now, I'm going to ask one more time. Ma'am, would you like me to drive you somewhere safe? Sarah looked at the stranger, trying to read his intentions. She didn't know anything about him, but he was offering her a way out of a situation that had been rapidly escalating toward violence. The alternative was staying here with three angry men who had already made their intentions clear.
Yes, Sarah said.
Please, get in the truck, the stranger said, never taking his eyes off Jake and his companions. Leave your car. You can come back for it tomorrow when there are more people around. Sarah hurried to the passenger side of the stranger's truck, her legs shaking with adrenaline. As she climbed inside, she heard Jake's voice, loud and angry. This isn't over, Mitchell. Not by a long shot. The stranger waited until Sarah was safely in the truck before responding. Friend, if I were you, I'd be real careful about making threats in front of witnesses, especially when those witnesses have their own truck and trailer and can be hard to track down afterward. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, but before pulling away, he rolled down his window and spoke to the three men one more time. Boys, I don't know what this lady did to make you so angry. But threatening women in parking lots is where I draw the line. If I hear about anything happening to her, I'll be back to have a more detailed conversation with each of you. And trust me, you won't enjoy that conversation near as much as this one. As they drove away, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe normally. She had no idea who the stranger was or where he was taking her, but for the first time in months, she felt safe. The man who had rescued her from what could have been a very bad situation was about to become the most important person in her life, though neither of them knew it yet. Thank you, Sarah said as they reached the main road. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Nothing good, the stranger replied grimly. My name's Cole Dawson, by the way, and I have a feeling your troubles are just getting started. Cole Dawson drove in silence for several minutes, giving Sarah time to collect herself while he navigated the dark country roads outside Millbrook. The interior of his truck smelled like leather, hay, and something else Sarah couldn't identify, perhaps gun oil. A CB radio mounted under the dashboard occasionally crackled with distant conversations between truckers and ranchers. Where are we going? Sarah finally asked, realizing she had gotten into a stranger's truck without any idea of his intentions or destination. There's a diner about 20 miles north of here, Cole replied, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. Open all night, plenty of people around, good coffee. Seemed like a safe place to figure out what comes next. Sarah studied his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. Cole appeared to be in his late 30s, with weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hands on the steering wheel were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked with horses and cattle. But there was something else about him, a wariness in his eyes, that suggested he was familiar with more than just ranch work. What were you doing in Millbrook? Sarah asked. I mean, with the horse trailer and all. Delivering a horse to a rancher outside town, Cole said. I transport livestock between ranches, sometimes break horses for people who don't have the time or expertise. It's honest work that lets me move around without anyone asking too many questions. There was something in the way he said that last part that made Sarah wonder what kinds of questions Cole preferred to avoid. But after what had just happened in the library parking lot, she wasn't in a position to be picky about her rescuer's background. The diner Cole had mentioned was exactly what he had promised. Bright, busy, despite the late hour, and filled with the kind of people who minded their own business. Truckers, night shift workers, and late-night travelers created a constant flow of anonymous faces. Cole chose a booth in the back corner where he could watch both the entrance and the rear exit. "You hungry?" he asked as they settled into the red vinyl seats. Sarah realized she hadn't eaten since lunch, but her stomach was still too knotted with stress to handle food. "Just coffee, thanks." Cole ordered coffee for both of them and a piece of apple pie for himself. When the waitress left, he leaned back and studied Sarah with the same careful attention he had given to the diner's exits. "So," he said finally, "want to tell me what those boys were so upset about? Must be something pretty serious to have 3 grown men cornering a woman in a parking lot." Sarah found herself telling Cole the entire story, from discovering the first invoice discrepancy to the months of investigation, harassment, and isolation that followed. She wasn't sure why she was being so open with a complete stranger, but there was something about Cole's quiet attention that made her feel like he understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of powerful people. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee and processing what he had heard. "That took guts," he said finally. "Most people would have kept their mouths shut and hoped someone else would deal with it." "Most people are smarter than I am," Sarah replied bitterly. "Look where my courage got me." "I've lost my job, my home, my friends, and now people are threatening me with physical violence. Maybe I should have minded my own business." "No," Cole said firmly. "You did the right thing. The fact that it cost you everything doesn't make it wrong. It makes the people you expose desperate and dangerous. Desperate enough to hurt me." Cole considered the question seriously. "From what you've told me, they've already escalated from economic pressure to threats of violence. People don't usually stop there once they've crossed that line. They either back down completely or they keep escalating until someone gets hurt." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Sarah. "So, what am I supposed to do?" "I can't leave town until the trial is over, and even then, where am I going to go? I have no money, no job prospects, no references that won't be tainted by what happened here." "You need protection," Cole said simply. "Either from the law or from someone else. The law doesn't seem very interested in protecting me. The local police act like I'm the problem, and the state investigators are focused on building their case, not on my personal safety." Cole nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Small-town corruption usually goes deeper than just 1 or 2 bad actors. If the police won't protect you, it's probably because they have their own reasons for wanting this to go away quietly. Sarah felt her last hope draining away. If she couldn't count on law enforcement to protect her, and she had no family or friends willing to help, she was essentially on her own, against people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and threats. "I might be able to help," Cole said quietly. Sarah looked up at him in surprise. "You don't even know me. Why would you want to get involved in this mess?" Cole was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't asked. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older guilt. "Because I know what it's like to be on the wrong side of people with money and power. And because I know what happens when nobody stands up for what's right."
What do you mean?
Cole hesitated, clearly debating how much to tell her. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "My name's Cole Dawson now, but it wasn't always. 5 years ago, I was Detective Cole Davidson with the Denver Police Department. I was working a case involving police corruption. Officers taking money from drug dealers, evidence disappearing from lockups, witnesses being intimidated into silence." Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. Cole's story had parallels to her own situation, but with much higher stakes. "I spent 2 years building a case against a network of corrupt cops and the organized crime figures they were protecting. I thought I was being careful, thought I could trust my partner and my supervisor. I was wrong." Cole's hand tightened around his coffee mug, and Sarah could see the muscle in his jaw working as he continued. 3 days before we were supposed to make arrests, someone leaked information about the investigation. The main target scattered, witnesses disappeared, and evidence vanished. Worse, word got out that I was the one building the case against other cops. What happened? "They tried to kill me," Cole said matter-of-factly. "Car bomb in my driveway. I was lucky. A neighbor's dog was barking at something, so I went to check before getting in my car. The bomb went off while I was still 20 feet away, blew out every window on the block and left a crater where my car used to be." Sarah stared at him in shock. "Did they catch who did it?" "Oh, they investigated," Cole said with bitter irony, concluded it was probably drug dealers I had arrested seeking revenge. Very convenient conclusion that didn't point fingers at anyone still wearing a badge. "But you knew better." "I knew better, but I couldn't prove it. And more importantly, I knew it wasn't over. The message was clear. Keep pushing this investigation and the next bomb won't miss. Sarah was beginning to understand why Cole had been so willing to intervene in her situation. So you gave up being a police officer? I had a choice. I could back down, let the corruption continue, and probably live a long, quiet life as a cop who learned to look the other way. Or I could keep fighting and probably end up dead in an alley somewhere with the investigation dying with me. You chose the third option. I chose to disappear. Cole Davidson died in that car bombing, as far as the official records are concerned. Cole Dawson was born about 6 months later in Wyoming, complete with a new identity and a deliberately unremarkable job that lets him move around without attracting attention. The confession hung between them in the diner's fluorescent-lit atmosphere. Sarah realized that the man sitting across from her had given up everything, his career, his identity, his entire life, rather than compromise with corruption. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because you're facing the same choice I faced. You can run, try to disappear, and hope they leave you alone. You can give in to their demands and recant your testimony. Or you can stand and fight, knowing that it might cost you everything. What would you do if you were in my situation?" Cole considered the question seriously. Honestly, 5 years ago, I thought running was the smart choice. I told myself I was being strategic, that I could fight another day from a position of safety. But you know what I learned? What? There is no position of safety when you're dealing with people who have already decided you're a threat. They don't stop hunting you just because you disappear. If anything, it makes them more determined because now you're a loose end that needs to be tied up permanently. The implication was chilling. Sarah had hoped that if she could just endure until the trial was over, she could leave Millbrook and start fresh somewhere else. But Cole was suggesting that leaving might not be enough, that the people she had exposed would continue to see her as a threat no matter where she went. So what's the alternative? You make sure the truth comes out completely and publicly. You make sure everyone involved faces consequences serious enough that they can't come after you later. And in the meantime, you stay alive long enough to see justice done. And how exactly do I do that? I'm one person against a network of corrupt officials and businessmen who have already shown they're willing to use violence. Cole leaned forward, his expression intense. You don't do it alone. You find allies, people who have the skills and motivation to help you see this through. Like who? Everyone in this town has either turned against me or is too scared to get involved. Like someone who has experience dealing with corrupt officials and dangerous people. Someone who has his own reasons for wanting to see justice done. Sarah stared at him. You're talking about yourself. I'm talking about someone who has spent 5 years running from a fight he should have finished. Someone who might have found a chance to do the right thing, even if it's 5 years too late. The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Cole was clearly capable and experienced, but accepting his help would mean involving him in a situation that could get them both killed. Why? Sarah asked. Why would you risk your new life for someone you just met? Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring out the diner window at the dark highway beyond. When he finally answered, his voice was soft but determined. Because 5 years ago, I let corruption win. I let good people down and let bad people get away with destroying lives. I've been telling myself it was the smart choice, the strategic choice, but really, it was just the coward's choice. He turned back to meet her eyes. Maybe this is my chance to stop running and start fighting back. Maybe helping you is how I redeemed the choice I made 5 years ago. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. For months, she had been completely alone, abandoned by everyone she had thought she could count on. Now, a stranger was offering to risk everything to help her see justice done. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. First, we make sure you stay safe. Those men tonight were just the beginning. They'll escalate their tactics until they either scare you into backing down or eliminate you as a problem. We need to stay ahead of them. And then? Then we make sure your testimony destroys them completely. Not just the people you've already identified, but everyone who's been enabling or protecting them. We don't just win this case. We make sure they never have the power to threaten anyone else again. Cole's plan was ambitious and dangerous, but as Sarah sat in the diner considering her alternatives, she realized it might be her only real choice. She could keep running and hoping for the best, or she could make a stand with someone who understood the stakes and had the skills to help her survive them. Okay, Sarah said finally. What do we do first? Cole smiled for the first time since she had met him, and Sarah saw something fierce and determined in his expression that gave her hope. First, we disappear for a few days while we plan our next move. I know places they'll never think to look, people who don't ask questions and don't talk to strangers. Then we start hitting back. As they left the diner together, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. She was no longer alone in her fight against corruption and intimidation. She had found an ally who understood the cost of standing up for truth, and who was willing to risk everything to make sure justice prevailed. What she didn't yet understand was just how high that cost would be, or how far the corruption in Millbrook extended. The real test of their partnership was still to come, and it would demand more courage from both of them than either had ever been called upon to show. Cole drove them through the night to a cabin in the Absaroka Mountains, 2 hours northeast of Millbrook. The property belonged to an old rancher named Pete Kowalski, who had helped Cole establish his new identity years earlier. Pete asked no questions about why Cole needed a safe place for himself and a frightened woman, just handed them keys to a guest cabin and promised that nobody would find them there unless they wanted to be found. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, basic kitchen, and 2 small bedrooms. More importantly, it was isolated, accessible only by a winding dirt road that would make surprise visits impossible. Cole showed Sarah how to work the radio that connected to Pete's main house, then spent an hour walking the perimeter and setting up early warning systems that would alert them to any approaching vehicles. "Get some sleep," Cole told Sarah as dawn broke over the mountains. "Tomorrow we start planning how to finish this thing properly." Sarah tried to rest, but her mind was spinning with everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Less than a day ago, she had been an isolated whistleblower facing threats and intimidation alone. Now she had an ally with law enforcement experience and a personal understanding of corruption. It felt too good to be true, which made her wonder if she was making another mistake in trusting Cole. But as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of Cole moving around the cabin, checking locks and preparing defenses, Sarah realized that her instincts told her Cole was genuine. He had intervened in the parking lot when he could have simply driven past. He had shared deeply personal information about his own past when he could have remained mysterious. Most importantly, he was taking practical steps to keep her safe rather than just offering empty reassurances. When Sarah finally fell asleep, she slept better than she had in months. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Cole was cooking breakfast while monitoring a police scanner and reviewing maps of the area around Millbrook. The kitchen table was covered with papers, including copies of Sarah's evidence against the fraud ring and handwritten notes in Cole's careful script. "How long have you been awake?" Sarah asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot Cole had made. "A few hours. Old habits from police work, always up early, always thinking through contingencies." Cole gestured to the papers on the table. "I've been reviewing your evidence and trying to map out the connections between the various players." Sarah looked at Cole's notes and was impressed by the thoroughness of his analysis. He had created a web diagram showing relationships between the corrupt officials, the contractors receiving fraudulent payments, and the political networks that had protected them. Some of the connections were based on Sarah's evidence, but others came from Cole's research into public records and his understanding of how corruption networks typically operated. "You've identified more people than I even knew were involved," Sarah observed. "That's the thing about corruption," Cole explained. "It's never just about the people taking money. There are always others who know what's happening but look the other way, people who benefit indirectly, people who provide political protection. A successful prosecution has to go after the entire network, not just the obvious bad actors." Cole had identified at least a dozen additional people who appeared to be connected to the fraud scheme, including the mayor, 2 city council members, and the president of the Chamber of Commerce. The scope of the corruption was much larger than Sarah had realized. "This is overwhelming," Sarah said, staring at the diagram. "How do we possibly take on this many people?" "One step at a time," Cole replied. "But first, we need to make sure they can't silence you before you get a chance to testify. That means staying ahead of their attempts to find you and neutralizing their ability to use violence." As if summoned by his words, the police scanner crackled with a transmission that made both of them freeze. "All units, be on the lookout for Sarah Mitchell, white female, 34 years old, driving a blue Honda Civic. Subject is wanted for questioning in connection with threatening phone calls made to several prominent local business owners." Sarah stared at the scanner in disbelief. "Threatening phone calls? I haven't made any threatening calls to anyone." "They're manufacturing charges against you," Cole said grimly. "Classic intimidation tactic. If they can get a warrant issued, they can arrest you and hold you while they figure out their next move." The radio continued with more details about the supposed warrant and instructions for officers to approach Sarah with caution, as she might be emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. Sarah recognized the voice as belonging to Deputy Chief Marcus Webb, one of Tom Bradley's poker buddies.
"They're trying to paint me as crazy and dangerous," Sarah said, feeling sick.
"If they arrest me on fake charges, who's going to believe my testimony about the fraud?" "Nobody," Cole confirmed. "That's the point. They destroy your credibility and remove you from circulation in one move." Cole stood up and began gathering the papers from the table. "We need to move. If they're putting out false charges, they're probably already searching your apartment and tracking your known associates. It won't take them long to figure out that someone helped you leave that parking lot last night." They packed quickly, taking only essentials and leaving no trace of their presence at the cabin. Cole left a note and some cash for Pete, then led Sarah to his truck. But instead of heading back toward Millbrook, he drove deeper into the mountains, following logging roads that didn't appear on most maps. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as the truck bounced over increasingly rough terrain. "To see someone who might be able to help us level the playing field," Cole replied. "Someone who has her own reasons for wanting to see corruption exposed." The someone turned out to be Judge Margaret Winters, a retired federal judge who lived on a remote ranch in the mountains. Judge Winters had spent 30 years on the bench fighting political corruption and organized crime, earning a reputation for fearless integrity that had made her numerous enemies. She had retired to Montana 5 years earlier, seeking peace and quiet after a career spent in the crosshairs of dangerous people. Judge Winters was a formidable woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She listened to Sarah's story and Cole's analysis without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated her understanding of both legal procedures and criminal tactics. "They're moving faster than I expected," Judge Winters said when they finished their presentation. "Fabricating charges against you suggests they're more desperate than I would have anticipated at this stage of the investigation." "What does that mean for Sarah's safety?" Cole asked.
"It means they've decided that legal intimidation isn't working fast enough," Judge Winters replied bluntly.
"They're escalating to direct action, which puts her in immediate physical danger." Judge Winters walked to a wall safe and removed several items, including a secure satellite phone and what appeared to be official credentials of some kind. "I may be retired, but I still have contacts in federal law enforcement," she explained. "I'm going to make some calls and see if we can get federal protection for Sarah and expedite the investigation." While Judge Winters made her calls, Cole and Sarah reviewed their options. The fake charges meant that local law enforcement was now actively hunting for Sarah, which eliminated most of their safe hiding places. They needed somewhere secure enough to avoid capture, but accessible enough for Sarah to cooperate with the federal investigation. Judge Winters returned from her phone calls with mixed news. "The good news is that the FBI is very interested in this case," she reported. A fraud scheme this size involving public officials typically indicates broader organized crime connections. They're willing to provide protection for Sarah and fast-track the investigation. "What's the bad news?" Sarah asked. "The bad news is that it will take at least 48 hours to arrange protective custody and coordinate with the state investigation. In the meantime, you're on your own against people who have demonstrated they're willing to use violence." Cole absorbed this information with the calm professionalism Sarah had come to associate with him. "We can handle 48 hours," he said, "but we need a plan that keeps Sarah safe while ensuring the evidence gets to the right people." Judge Winters smiled approvingly. "I was hoping you would say that. I have a proposition for both of you." The judge's plan was audacious and risky, but it offered the best chance of ensuring both Sarah's safety and the success of the prosecution. Instead of hiding and waiting for federal protection, they would go on the offensive, using Sarah's knowledge of the evidence and Cole's law enforcement experience to gather additional proof of the conspiracy, while staying ahead of their pursuers. "The key is to give the FBI enough evidence to justify immediate federal intervention," Judge Winters explained. "Right now, they're looking at a local fraud case. But if we can prove connections to interstate commerce, organized crime, or other federal crimes, they can take over the case immediately and provide comprehensive protection." Over the next 6 hours, they developed a detailed plan. Sarah would use her access to county records to gather additional evidence about the fraud scheme, while Cole would conduct surveillance on the key players to document their attempts to coordinate a response to the investigation. Judge Winters would coordinate with federal authorities and ensure that all evidence was properly preserved and authenticated. The plan required Sarah to return to Millbrook, despite the warrant for her arrest. It was dangerous, but Judge Winters convinced her it was necessary. "They expect you to run and hide," the judge explained. They've planned for that contingency. What they haven't planned for is you coming back and continuing to gather evidence against them. As evening approached, Sarah and Cole prepared to return to the valley. Sarah felt the familiar knot of fear in her stomach, but it was tempered by something she hadn't felt in months: hope. She was no longer fighting alone, and she finally had a plan that might actually work. The drive back to Millbrook took them through winding mountain roads as darkness fell. Cole had equipped Sarah with a secure radio and planned multiple escape routes in case their mission was discovered. Most importantly, he had taught her basic surveillance detection techniques and given her a weapon, a small pistol, that he assured her was legal for self-defense. "I've never owned a gun before," Sarah confessed, as Cole showed her how to safely handle the weapon. "I hope you never have to use it," Cole replied. "But the people we're dealing with have already moved beyond legal intimidation. You need to be prepared to defend yourself if talking and running don't work." As they reached the outskirts of Millbrook, Sarah felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a quiet accountant with a comfortable, predictable life. Now she was returning to town as a wanted fugitive, armed and accompanied by a man with a false identity, preparing to risk everything to expose corruption that went to the heart of her community. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had taken an outsider, a man who had been forced to abandon his own fight against corruption, to give her the support and courage she needed to continue hers. Cole had become more than just an ally. He had become the partner she needed to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. As they drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook under cover of darkness, Sarah realized that her story wasn't really about a woman who spoke out against corruption. It was about what happened when someone with courage found someone else with the skills and determination to make that courage count. It was about the price of truth and the value of having someone willing to pay that price alongside you. The final confrontation was still ahead of them, and Sarah knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the powerful people she had challenged would succeed in silencing her permanently. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she felt ready for whatever came next. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference in the world. The conclusion of their mission would test every skill Cole had learned as a detective and every ounce of courage Sarah had developed as a whistleblower. Together, they would face down a conspiracy that reached higher and deeper than either had imagined, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the strongest forces for justice. By dawn, the truth would finally be fully exposed. The guilty would be facing federal charges, and Sarah would be free to rebuild her life, knowing that she had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The cowboy who had ridden to her rescue would discover that saving someone else had been the key to redeeming himself, and both of them would understand that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what was right even when you were afraid. In the end, they had protected each other, and together they had protected the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.